Education, an important cause of poverty in both periods, can be found in the poor education attainment or insufficient accumulation of human capital of the poor. Lewis, for example, notes that a lack of proper education is one of the factors that was emphasized by all the poor whites commissions, including the Carnegie Commission. To solve the poor education problem, the state formed missionary schools in 1841 with teachers that were imported from England, who came with new teaching methods and content. Black poverty today is partly a consequence of poor educational practices conducted during the preceding 5 decades. According to Fiske and Ladd, 4 aspects of apartheid were particularly pertinent for black education: residential segregation and persistent poverty among blacks, inadequate resources and low-quality infrastructure for black children, low levels of educational attainment among black adults, and the absence of a culture of learning. The Black Education Act of 1953 separated black education from white education, and that quickly messed up black schools. State spending on missionary schools, once the backbone of black education, ceased in 1957 in an attempt to gain ideological control over the black intelligentsia, who were the product of a missionary-based education system. Since 1994, the budget for black education has increased. However, nothing has happened on the ground. Even today, majority of black schools have fewer resources compared to white schools. The poor performance of formerly black schools with respect to delivering adequately educated workers to the job market was historically and continues to be one of the main causes of poverty and unemployment amongst black people. Demography and the environment. The Anglo-Boer War and the Rinderpest of 1896 and 1897 drastically increased white poverty. But it must be noted that events are not the cause of poverty, but they worsen it. Moreover, it is said that the mercantile intermediaries during the 1880s restricted white farmers to develop modernized farming techniques. The chronic poverty of the farmers ensured their dependence on credit facilities and a lack of both working and investment capital. The farmers' mercantile enslavement not only hampered the transition to commercial agriculture, but also helped to bankrupt small farmers on uneconomical units. Moreover, Fourie states that during 1870s, the interference of state in agriculture destroyed smaller farmers. As a result, majority of small-scale farmers were made to be the tenants in farms of wealthy landowners. Most of the wealthy farmers were Afrikaners who bought out the small-scale farmers. Other factors that contributed to the poor white problem are the poor agricultural practices, poor agricultural land, and worsened by droughts. As a consequence, many Afrikaners embarked on the second great trek from rural areas to cities. Urbanization was worsened among the Afrikaners because only 2% of their population was living in cities in 1890. Wages were low, jobs scarce, and labor unorganized. The poor education of the urbanized Afrikaners contributed to their inability to find well-paying jobs and to form labor unions. The new Afrikaner migrants from farms had no contacts in the city, so majority of them occupied small rooms in informal towns that sprang up, some of which were considered the worst in the world. Crime was huge in these informal towns. For a long time, Afrikaners found crime or prostitution to be their only means of survival. In the 1930s, Afrikaners migrated to cities again due to Great Depression of 1929 and droughts. The government tried to stop urban overpopulation through offering loans to farmers and provided more support for the unemployed and created more jobs in public works programs. For black people, migration to urban areas was controlled strictly because even before 1948, blacks were prohibited from residing in metropolitan areas. This was done mainly to prevent shortage of workers in farms and in mines, and to deprive black people of political rights, e.g. universal suffrage. Inequality gap between rural blacks and urban blacks led to migration of blacks to urban areas. The Urban Areas Act of 1945 and Verwoerd's 1952 Influx Control Act led to the creation of townships for black people. As time goes on, squatter camps sprang up around Johannesburg. As a consequence, the government developed Soweto and Alexandria, but for rental homes. In 1988, only 32.6% of black people lived in cities and metropolitan areas. Language and culture. By the end of the 19th century, white poverty was mainly an Afrikaner farmer's problem. Only a minority of English farmers were poor. These farmers were far from modern technology and they failed to acquaint themselves with modernization. So they settled for pioneer life of subsistence and simplicity. Furthermore, urban migrating Afrikaners struggled to speak English, thus reducing chances of getting employed. This was due to poor education and their reluctance to learn English. Yet, the language of trade and commerce was English, with many of the business owners and artisans having come to South Africa during the gold rush. As a result, they were forced into low-pay manual work or unemployment. The Roman Dutch law of inheritance also messed up with property, because it entitled every child to a portion of his father's estate, even if these portions were insufficient to support a family. Due to negligence of white farmers by the government, it took a long time for them to adapt to change. Rural black people find it hard to adapt to new technology or lifestyles too. Early explorers and missionaries observed that natives rejected new tools, products and skills except for alcohol and tobacco. This is the phenomenon of traditional people. However, by the end of 19th century, before discrimination, black people had already learned the skills in industrial sector. Some did semi-skilled and skilled work, but that was quickly stopped, thus forcing black people into subsistence farming in the reserves. Furthermore, the poor education received under the apartheid government ill-equipped them for a move to the cities after the abolition of influx control. Language formed an obstacle, as most of the informal sector was either English or African speaking. The rural black traditional culture and lifestyle was in many respects different to the culture of the white population. For example, in rural areas, black farmers made use of traditional communal land for grazing and herding, while property rights ensured individual ownership in the white economy. Furthermore, many rural blacks settled in sprawling townships on the outskirts of large cities, where intolerable living conditions have often persisted to this day. Their poor living conditions and weak education background did little to assist them in finding employment in the formal sector. So many were forced into a life of underemployment or unemployment. Education, an important